Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this virtual budget town hall with Mayor Brandon Scott. I want to thank you for joining us. This is for our upcoming budget, the fiscal 2024 budget season. We are going to let everyone join us, get a few more folks in the room before we get started. We're going to have a very robust conversation about the budget process, how the budget is made, and what this process looks like. And of course, most importantly, take your questions about everything budget related. We're live on both Facebook and Instagram, as we often are here in the city of Baltimore. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And we are going to jump into it. Our budget in Baltimore is critical to ensuring that we meet the needs of our residents, and we want to hear what you think about as we go through together in building the fiscal 2024 budget. Historically, input from taxpayers and residents of Baltimore has only happened at Taxpayers Night, and I thought we should do it in a way where we hear from the citizens more than once and reach everyday Baltimoreans. So tonight's event is about hearing about your funding priorities and really sharing information about the city's budget and budget process. I am joined tonight on International Women's Day by two fabulous women who work in the city of Baltimore, our budget director, Laura Larson, and our capital improvement program planner, Kristen Hearn, who will discuss the city's both the operating and capital budgets. And after we hear from them, we'll ask you some questions and ask that you share your thoughts with us on Facebook and Instagram, and we will take a question from you. In my action plan that we released last year, responsible stewardship of city resources, also known as taxpayer dollars, is one of our actions that we are committed to doing, and that's expanding engagement and education around the city's budget. And to make that reality, we launched this budget series. These sessions include tonight's virtual session and allow us to share information about the budget and budget process, of course, answer your questions. The city is currently planning the budget for fiscal year 2024, which begins in July. Our budget years are July 1 to June 30th. In April, the Department of Finance will introduce the preliminary budget to the Board of Estimates, the City Spending Board, for consideration. On the 26th of April, the Board of Estimates will host Taxpayers Night to hear from more residents. In May, the board will then vote on the budget and send it over to the City Council, and they will host Taxpayers Night and hearings before voting on the budget that will go into effect in July the 1st. We have two portions of the city's budget, the operating and the capital. Operating funds the day-to-day operations of city government, of course, trash service, police service, emergency response, park and recs, all of those things, and the staff and materials needed to run those services. The capital budget funds physical infrastructure, the buildings, bridges, roads, those things. And both budgets are built and based on expected revenue and spending, with agencies submitting a budget request for what they plan to accomplish in that fiscal year. And in the capital sense, it's a 6-year plan as well. These requests are reviewed by the Department of Finance and Planning, as well as my team, and we put those things together. That's why we're here tonight. To hear what your priority for the upcoming fiscal year is. And I'm now going to turn it over to our budget director to talk about where the money comes from, where the money goes in the operating budget. And as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, put that in the comments now, and we will get to those. But we want folks to be engaged in this process as well. Madam Budget Director.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction, Mr. Mayor. So tonight we are, as the Mayor mentioned, we're going to talk to you a little bit about how the city's budget gets built. And then we're going to dive into both on the operating budget side and on the capital budget side, where the money comes from and where the money goes. So we'll go ahead and we'll dive into some materials we put together for you guys tonight on the fourth slide of our deck. For the current fiscal year, as the Mayor mentioned, that started on July 1st of 2022, that will go until June 30th of 2023. That budget, the fiscal 23 budget, was $4.1 billion. And you can see here that about just over 19% of that went to those capital assets and infrastructure investments, and about just over 80% was used to fund the day-to-day operating costs. So on the next slide, we can check out the schedule that the city uses to build the budget. So the planning effort around how the operating budget comes together, the operating and capital budgets come together, really starts in the summer as we start to forecast and understand sort of how much will it cost us to provide the same level of service that we're providing today next year. At the same time, we're also looking at revenue and trying to understand what's happening with all the different revenues.
Madam Budget Director, I'm going to jump in I think it's important to note when we talk about that CLS, that current level of service, right? That baseline is what it would cost to do the same service this year than the previous year. Can you, for our folks and our residents that are listening, talk about how that cost is different? Like Fat Joe saying yesterday's price is not today's price comes to mind, but I think it's important to note because sometimes folks will see an increase for an agency from one year to the next and think that like in the actual sense that they're getting more money, but the same price that you paid last year, even if it's slightly higher the next year, might actually mean that there's less service or a cut. Can you talk about that as you go through that?
Yeah, for sure. So just like we all experience in our budgets at home, things cost more money year over year. And so when we do those adjustments in that August to October timeframe, what we're doing is we're going through and really looking carefully at all of the agencies and saying, okay, what do we need to fund in order to keep doing the same thing we're doing next year? And some of the things that will really change those numbers without impacting the level of service we're providing are things like how much it costs to pay our employees. City employees, their compensation is driven by the contracts we have with the different labor unions that represent our employees. And so what we budget for those wages is in line with those contracts that we've agreed to with our unions. The other big piece of that are things like employee benefits, so our pension costs. The city has to make sure that we're fully funding our pension requirements for city employees, but also things like health insurance and that sort of thing. So when you look at the city's budget, what we try to do is really try to explain where we're making those adjustments and where we're seeing a service impact, and those decisions come later in the process versus what are these early adjustments that we're making to the cost or just to account for inflation. So in terms of the process, that work happens in the fall. Then we go into November, really into December, and that's where agencies are taking budget guidance and preparing their requests. They're saying, here's what we want to do next year. Here's how we can align our dollars with the goals and the priorities, and specifically with the mayor's action plan. And right now we're in the period of January through March where we're really compiling all that information together, updating all of our forecasts and our projections, and working closely with the mayor to make decisions about how should we allocate funding in next year's budget. That will give way to a lot of the steps that we just talked about that will happen in April. So you'll see the preliminary budget get introduced, released publicly on Thursday, April 6th, and be at Board of Estimates for hearings both on April 19th and 26th before the Board of Estimates votes and approves the budget and the Ordinance of Estimates that establishes the budget in May, and then ultimately that gives way to the council holding their hearings and then finally voting on the budget. So now that we have kind of a sense of how it all comes together and what the big picture numbers look like, we can go ahead and go on to the next slide where we'll talk about the operating budget revenues. So as I just mentioned, the city's total fiscal 23 budget is $4.1 billion. But when you peel that back and look just at the operating budget side, which represents about 80%, that gets you $3.3 billion in the current year. And so we take that $3.3 billion and we break it into different funds. And the funds are driven by where the money comes from. So the fund where we have the most discretion is the city's general fund. And in fiscal 23, that's $2.1 billion, or about 63% of the total operating budget. This is the fund where we have the most discretion. This is the fund where a lot of your local taxes, like your property tax, income tax, any sort of permit fee that you would pay to the city, that's all going into the general fund. That's what really funds the day-to-day of our operations. That's also the fund where our policymakers have the most discretion over how to allocate it. The other two types of funds are grants and enterprise funds. Those two things represent just under 40% of the 23 budget. Those funds are restricted, whether it's a grant, it might be restricted by the state or federal government that has given us money to do a very specific thing. On the enterprise fund, those are paid by ratepayers. The biggest breakout of those funds are the water fund, the stormwater fund, wastewater, that sort of thing. Now if we can go on to the next slide and talk just specifically about the general fund revenue for a minute. So as I just mentioned, the general fund represents about 63% of the total operating budget, or $2.1 billion. And you can see here what that looks like in terms of where that money comes from. And that light blue portion of the bar there is showing you the property tax that's paid by both homeowners and businesses in the community. In fiscal 23, that represents about $1 billion, just over $1 billion. So you can see that makes up about half of the money that's coming into the city's general fund. The next largest share of revenue that comes into the general fund is income tax. Again, that's what local residents are paying as part of their overall taxes. And in fiscal 23, that represents about $431 million of the city's general fund. So with that context of where our money comes from, let's now talk a little bit about where the money's going in terms of the expenditure budget. So we can advance ahead a couple slides, and we can look at how those dollars get allocated. So in the city's operating budget, we provide funding for 43 different agencies and offices. That represents every square corner of city government and the services that we provide to residents. When we look at how those dollars get allocated, we can look at it both from the perspective of all funds, so including the general fund and then those restricted funds, but we can also look at it just by the general fund. And what this chart is showing you is the top 5 city agencies in terms of their overall size of the budget. So when we look at the all funds budget, we can see that the 5 agencies with the largest budget are the Department of Public Works, the Police Department, City Schools, Fire, and Transportation. Now, when we look at just the general fund, and again, we look at those top 5 agencies with the biggest budget, the big thing that changes here is that police and public works sort of switch spots. So Public Works goes from having the biggest budget to actually having the smallest budget of those top 5, and the police department goes to having the largest budget. And what that is driven by is the Department of Public Works includes our water utility, our wastewater utility, stormwater utility, and that really represents the biggest share of the Department of Public Works budget. What is funded by the general fund is just the solid waste portion of the budget, and that's like your trash collection, recycling, vacant and abandoned property cleaning, that sort of thing.
And Madam Director, I think it's also important, because we know this conversation comes up a lot when you're talking about the school's budget, right? But and how that works, right? And what the city puts in versus what we historically put in, because we know now we're putting record amounts of funding into it, but also versus what the total budget is, right? Because folks will see some of these budget documents in language and think, for example, that the police department's budget is bigger than Baltimore City Public Schools, which I think we know that isn't true, but for average, everyday Baltimoreans, can you explain to them how that works, not just here in Baltimore, but across the state of Maryland?
For sure. So in Baltimore City and in the state of Maryland, the schools receive funding both from the local jurisdiction as well as directly from the state of Maryland. And so the share that that we're providing to the schools that's shown here, that's just what's coming directly from the city, and then they receive another tranche of funding that's coming directly from the state of Maryland that doesn't come through the city at all. And so when those state dollars are factored in, the school budget is actually, in fact, larger than what we're showing for the police department here. So let's go ahead and sort of break down the operating budget a little bit more specifically. And so on the next slide, we can see what the budget looks like broken out by some of the pillars in the mayor's action plan. So specifically, equitable neighborhood development. In fiscal 23, the budget includes $138.3 million for this pillar. This funds services that fall across 11 different city agencies and offices. Services provided here range from business development for small and minority-owned businesses to grants for some of the city's cultural institutions.
On the prioritizing youth?
Yeah, so I think we have to go back one slide and we can talk about prioritizing our youth. In fiscal 23, the budget has $563 million for this pillar. These dollars fund services, again, in 11 different city agencies and offices. And this includes everything from the city's contribution that goes to the schools to funding for programming and operating the city's rec centers, employment opportunities for young folks in the city, and then also additional support services for young people provided by different city agencies. For building public safety and the clean and healthy communities, those two are the two largest pillars when we look at the overall operating budget. Building public safety represents just under $1.1 billion in the fiscal 23 budget. It provides funding for services that fall across 13 different city agencies and offices. This would include services provided by the fire and police departments as well as the health department. It also includes services geared towards preventing violence and overall promotion of public safety.
And we'll do clean and healthy communities next.
Wonderful. So for clean and healthy communities, the 23 budget includes, again, just under $1.1 billion for different services provided by agencies for this item. These services include everything from trash collection to health services and clinics operations and support for our homeless services, different housing development activities, road resurfacing, park maintenance, as well as maintenance for the city's urban forest, as well as sustainability efforts that are promoted by our planning department. And then
responsible stewardship, right?
Yes, wonderful. So the final pillar is responsible stewardship of city resources. In 23, the city budget has $186.4 million for funding these different services that are involved in this pillar. That falls across 15 different agencies and offices. Services in this pillar include things like the city's finance department, HR, law, IT, and these services are really focused on improving accountability of city services, working to recruit and retain a strong workforce, and encouraging transparency and accountability across the government. So with that, we can turn it over to Kristen and talk more about the capital budget.
And Kristen, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Madam Budget Director. And now we'll talk about the capital budget, which is for our residents and everyone there. Is again about the infrastructure, the buildings, the bridges, the roads, those kind of things.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So we can go on to the slide about capital revenue, since Mr. Mayor introduced the capital budget and what it is. So the funding for the capital budget comes from a variety of sources, either current revenue or borrowed funds. And the amounts that are set aside for capital are determined during the operating budget process based on what the city can afford. Many of the sources in the capital budget are restricted to certain purposes or projects. So for example, the stormwater, water, and sewer utilities typically make up between 2/3 and 3/4 of the capital budget. State and federal funds are another really important source for things like investment in affordable housing, transportation infrastructure, and parks and recreation, but they're often restricted to certain uses or certain projects in particular. The unrestricted sources in the capital budget include general obligation bonds, general funds, which are often called pay-as-you-go or pay-go, and highway user revenue. And these sources typically make up between 10 and 25% of the capital budget. So these are the sources that fund city priorities, especially those for which there's no other fund source, like solid waste infrastructure or information technology, and they have to match state and federal funds when that's required. In fiscal 23, the capital budget totaled $793 million, but it can fluctuate considerably from year to year due to project schedules, the timing of borrowing, and the availability of grant funds and revenue bonds for utility projects. So for example, in fiscal year 22, the capital budget was just under $500 million, but in fiscal 28, it was over $1.1 billion.
Talk about why that big jump was.
So in fiscal 2028, that was driven by big appropriations, that's authority to spend, budgeted for the utilities within the Department of Public Works. So water, wastewater, and stormwater were in a cycle where they were budgeting for projects, and then they'll spend the next several years designing and getting into construction and spending those funds down. So the capital budget falls across 9 agencies. Again, the largest by far is the Department of Public Works, which typically comprises between 2/3 and 3/4 of the capital budget due to its inclusion of the stormwater, water, and sewer utilities. The next largest are Department of Transportation and Housing and Community Development, and that's in part due to the significant state and federal funding that these agencies receive and the amount of infrastructure that they oversee.
So now, and for us to put the slides up, right, so we want to talk about for the slides around the agency specific, and just we'll go through those so that our folks on Facebook can see that.
Sure. And then the Department of Recreation and Parks is an increasingly large share of the capital budget. Other agencies include Department of General Services, the Enoch Pratt Library System, the school system, which again, we make a contribution to for their capital budget, but they see a more significant allocation from the state to match city dollars. And that's in addition to some of the major initiatives like the 21st Century Schools program. The Department of General Services includes funding for buildings across multiple city agencies, including health, fire, and police departments. And so, as in many older cities, Baltimore's aging infrastructure often leads to higher cost. We work with all agencies to understand what it would take to bring everything up to a state of good repair, which, as you can imagine, agencies have described needs that well exceed the amount of available funding. So we work to target those limited resources to upgrading, maintaining structures, and identify additional fund sources where we can.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you both for helping us explain a little bit more in detail about what we were talking about versus the operating and the capital budgets, and what we want to have us go into a little bit of questions that we want to ask, and ask people to put their response into the comments. So the first question I really want to ask for folks is, what service or program provided by the city would you like to see that will be invested in more? So we're looking forward to seeing those answers come in on Instagram and Facebook. Also would like to hear about services that the city currently does or operates that you think we should stop doing. Things that you think the city has no business doing. And let me say before anyone says it, giving out tickets and towing cars is not an option. So other than those two, what do you think is a service that you think the city should stop doing? And services that you think are going well and ones you think could be improved upon. Those are the kind of things we would love to hear from you all before I go directly to your questions. And I know that I saw this come in, and for someone, we actually, just for someone, one thing that came in really quickly was about, we had 30,000 vacant houses. We actually are down now to 14,000, which is the lowest in my lifetime, but we're going to continue to work to make sure that we're getting those back from these slumlords and vacant landowners and get them back into productive use. All right. So one of the big focuses that are coming in, a lot of folks want to see more investment into the housing department, housing community development, which I think is a good thing for us because we have seen some investment there. We gave the housing department actually even extra money, $100 million from American Rescue Plan funds to support project development, affordable home ownership projects in Southwest Baltimore, Northwest Baltimore, and Park Heights Southwest, and in Uplands or Northeast and Chum, also to expand programs like the Buy Back the Block program. We're focusing on that, focus on middle income neighborhoods, but also expanding the housing upgrades to benefit seniors program. So thank you all for your responses. And someone said give more fines to store owners who are not up to code, which is another function that we're trying to expand with code enforcement and a focus from the housing department. So thank you for that. And I want to thank you all for joining us. Now I'm going to go right into some questions that we have here that we see here. And first question that actually came in off Instagram is there a budget for kids in each community in Baltimore City? So as you saw, there's a big priority of prioritizing our youth. So that impacts everything with young people, right? It impacts the ability for us to continue as we meet the requirements, the Carowin or the blueprint for Maryland's future to fully fund our schools. That increased money that we'll be continuing to give to the school system that goes up every year. And we are proud. Actually, many years ago, we were having a discussion with agencies how we were going to have to make some cuts to everyone else so that we can invest in our young people, our most precious resource. And just while we're here, I think it's important because we did talk about very briefly the 21st Century Schools program, because I want all of us to know in Baltimore that no city in this country has built or renovated more new schools in recent years than Baltimore. That's something that we should be proud of and continue to push, as we want all of our schools to be that way, but also providing the premier education for our young people as well. That also includes the historic investments that you heard both our capital and operating budget directors talk about in recreation and parks, right? We opened 4 and 5 new rec centers since I came into office, right? The brand new one in Middle Branch in South Baltimore. We did Cahill. We reopened Tawanda and Bocheck. And now we have 5 rec center projects that are in the design phase on the capital side now, what they're going to be built. That's the renovation of the historic Chip Webb. That's the brand new Parkview Rec Center that's going to be in West Baltimore. That's Curtis Bay in South Baltimore. That's the brand new Furley Rec Center that's going to be built brand new with the new Furley Elementary. Those are historic things, and that investment that includes the $40 million of ARPA funds to help bolster Rec and Parks capital budget, but also how we are hastening the pace of how we're doing that investment that we're going to be doing in pools and playgrounds and basketball courts all around the city. The next question was about, are there any funds for housing repairs and not just for the elderly and low income? For example, this person wants to know about folks who were the victim of predatory flippers. We actually have in last year's budget, and we're looking to work and expand that work, there was $2.35 million for capital housing repair and assistance program through our housing department. So you can reach out and just, when you go to baltimorecity.gov, go to agencies, click housing community development. That information is on that website. Let's see. Someone said we need money into housing and transportation and the homelessness. So I'll break those down in different ways. We talked a lot about housing already, so I'll park that and merge that in with homelessness. So we have made record levels of investments into the Mayor's Office of Homelessness Services, a $75 million commitment. And we're part of a program called House America with President Biden and Secretary Fudd from HUD, where they ask cities to set goals on how to rehouse a certain amount of folks who are experiencing homelessness in your jurisdiction and to get new units of affordable housing. And I'm proud to say that in the city, we actually exceeded the goals, our House America goals, on both aspects. And we want to continue that work that we're starting to see, and we're still doing the work of trying to identify things like purchasing a hotel to house some of our residents who are experiencing homelessness, but the rental assistance, all of those things play a part in how we're directly dealing with that through a budgetary standpoint that turns into programmatic action from our agencies on the ground. Transportation is something that we're going to work with our new fabulous governor on. Now that we have a governor that truly believes in Baltimore, but also understands that you will not have a 21st century city and region without 21st century transportation. As we know, MTA is a state agency. I look forward to working with our governor for bringing back some semblance of the red line, to improving our MTA bus system and other services that we have here, and also working in deep partnership with them on that. So someone just talked about, thank you for that question about investing more in park and recreation. I'll just park that one since I spent a bunch of time on that. Now, someone asked about how we can get funds earmarked for neighborhood associations and nonprofits who are doing the difficult work of addressing seniors. We had a separate one of these there earlier today for our older adults, where we talked to about 900 of them live on the telephone. There's opportunity for organizations to apply into grants and other opportunities through city government. However, as someone who wants to be responsible with taxpayers' dollars, this is not a situation where we can just dole out money, right? When you think about the ARPA money and all these other things, they come with very strict fiscal requirements. So we're always looking to partner with community organizations and CDCs and others, and we're going to continue to do that to make sure that we're meeting all of those needs, right? So when you think about our hubs, our housing upgrades to benefit seniors program, a lot of that money is actually going out and contracted to community groups, whether that be Civic Works, whether that be Green and Healthy Homes, and that creates opportunities too, because we're creating jobs for young people and people who are entering in society, who are now going out and learning a skill and a trade and working on those projects of putting heating and air conditioning and piping and greening and doing that. And we're doing the same thing with this investment into Clean Core, right? Clean Core, where we're now paying and working through contracts with local community organizations and CDCs, where they're hiring local people, local companies, local organizations to go out to bolster cleaning efforts. I actually got some videos from some young brothers who are now working with Lazarus Rights and some organizations in West Baltimore. They sent me on Instagram where they showed me the before and after, and they took pride of being able to cleaning up that dirty alley, and it makes them have more civic pride. And we're going to continue to do that investment as well. For our older adults, we also have specific programs like the money that we're giving for produce boxes and all of these foods, and we're looking to expanding that work. This is one that is near and dear to my heart. Someone said we need a facility to host, and I'm pretty sure because this is a track person that I know this person, to host indoor youth and track and field events, and I say that the mayor agrees wholeheartedly. And we know that ultimately we want to build this facility. We know where we want to build this facility. I'll let the secret out. We want to build it right at Moravia and Sinclair. We are always doing the deep planning of that work, but we also have to wait until the renovations are done with City High School and the brand new Furley is open and Northeast Middle is renovated, so that that whole campus is vacated, and then we can start there. This is, I guess, is a good problem to have, because for once we're talking about actually having a problem where we need to put young people because their schools are getting built or renovated brand new, but it does also negatively impact this. Let's see. So someone said bringing back the dollar houses. It was never canceled. I think that this is one of the biggest myths in the city, is that they were giving out all of these houses for $1,000 or $1. You can, if you go into our buy into Be More Buy into Baltimore on the Housing Department website, you can get these vacant properties at a very, very low rate. Sometimes it's $1, sometimes it's hundreds, sometimes it's a couple thousand, right? But what I will also caution folks is how many of these folks that we had these dollar houses go to back in the day, or way back in the day, that are still vacant. Because if you give them a house for $1, but the house actually needs $100,000, $200,000 of work, and they don't have it, we're still going to be in the same situation. So I would encourage everyone to look into Buy into Baltimore, because there are so many people that are actually going out and getting these properties, and not only just renovating them to sell, but renovating and renting, and even moving into them themselves. Let's see here. All right. So there, someone asked how to RSVP for the in-person town hall. There's a link right on a Facebook page, and we'll put that on Instagram as well, that you can see to get that to do just that. Let's see. Someone asked us a great question. Will there be funding set aside for those with developmental disabilities so that they can reach jobs and careers? This is something that I've challenged my team with doing as someone who served on the board of the Abilities Network for many years, to look at how we can deepen that work through our Office of Employment Development and others who has done that work and still does it, but we need to take that work to the next level, especially coming out of the pandemic. So thank you for that question. Someone said eviction prevention for families. We are still running eviction prevention in the city. We've spent lots and lots and lots and millions of dollars in eviction prevention. We know how important that is, and we're looking forward to trying to figure out creative ways to extending that, even knowing that the federal money itself is going to come to an end at some point. Let's see. Thank you for that. So someone said, how are we monitoring the workforce development thus for both youth and adults to ensure success? When you have, MOED does great work, and we're monitoring it by not only seeing the success, working with those employers and seeing, tracking and see how the folks are doing there, but also letting those folks who are getting those trainings tell us the story as well, right? People who were looking for employment that were through a hire up or train up program who lost a job during the pandemic that wasn't coming back, quite frankly, and we were able to retrain them for something that they now have another skill in providing for their families. And we're looking now really to how do we build upon that, expand that, and create more of those workforce training programs for industries that we know that we need people for, CDL drivers and other workers that we know that we're gonna need in the city. Let's see. Someone said, what are we getting out of the funding for police? I think anyone watching knows that I know and understand that public safety is about a lot more than just the police department. But for that portion, when you think about the record number of illegal guns that they took off the street, when we think about the fact that now, for example, we had someone from Los Angeles shadowing the police commissioner last week, that Baltimore, when from a reform effort, is seen as really the leader in the country. Are we where we need to be? Obviously not, because we're still in a consent decree, but we are light years ahead of where we were. But we also have to, again, understand that building public safety in Baltimore should have never been placed solely on the feet of the police department. And now that we're creating, through my leadership, of creating that understanding that we have to have a complete and comprehensive ecosystem to dealing with that. That's why we're expanding the work of Safe Streets. That's why we're investing in community-based organizations like We Are Us and others. That's why we're expanding victim services. So I want everyone to hear this and hear this very clearly. Until I announced it last year, gunshot victims in Baltimore were not eligible for victim services. That was the most ridiculous thing that I've heard in my time in government. We have to build that kind of work, and expanding the work that we're doing with our group violence reduction strategy that we started in the Western District, where we're doing the both and approach, going and telling people, we want you to change your life so that you can be alive for your family, but we need you to take these other opportunities, whether that be job training, education, substance abuse, relocation, housing, whatever they need. But if they don't take it, then we're going to have to go the law enforcement route, and we look forward to building that up. Let's see here. So someone said that we need more youth activity. What about midnight basketball? Midnight basketball has been back for a few years. We talked about basketball courts. We're going to be doing more of those now that we started the renovation process and resurfacing for many of them last year. Rec and Parks, through my ARPA investment, has a long list of them that they're going to get through in partnership with Parks and People. We'll be doing playgrounds, a heavy lift of that, and also with our partners who we do playgrounds with from around the country. We are the first city to be a part of that innovative program, and we're going to continue to do that work here in the city of Baltimore. So someone said, are there any plans to look into public works salaries? So we're going to be, the salaries are set through negotiations. We'll be negotiating with bargaining units and unions, and we'll continue to do that and make sure that we are able to, one of the things that I've challenged my folks of doing, of looking at how long the city's been behind the 8 ball on how we are staffing and funding, for that so that we can raise that level up so that we can attract more people and keep more people, because we are bringing these folks in and they're leaving. But I want to say this and be very clear that even the private industry is having a struggle with solid waste workers. People have changed the way that they want to provide for their families after the pandemic, and we have to understand that, and we have to evolve as a government to meeting those needs in a different way. All right. Someone said, is there any plans for a 4-day work week? Not as of right now, no. We will see how that comes in the future. And that's another great point about reconstructing the juvenile system so that there's opportunity for kids and requirement for job training careers. This is something I've already said to the governor and the folks in Annapolis about, is that we have to build a new an innovative system of how we're dealing with juvenile justice, because the way we're doing clearly in many cases isn't working, and I'm looking forward to that. All right, I got 2 more coming in. Someone said, again, eviction prevention. We still have that available. If you go to our website, baltimorecity.gov, and look at the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success, you can see that information is there. And so someone asked about credit on property tax for anyone who has lived in their home for 15 years or more. So if you do not get a homestead tax credit, you should. So you should be making sure that you're Googling that and making sure that you're getting that. And I will say stay tuned. In the next year or so, you'll probably be hearing from me about some ways that I think that we can push in order for us to have even deeper property tax relief throughout the city. Someone also mentioned better lighting throughout the city. That's something that we've talked about in partnership with BGE, because this is sorry about that. Hey, excuse me one second. Someone said that that we need to do that, and we know that we'll be working on that as well. And all right, and there was a question about Easterwood. So we had about $850,000 budgeted for Easterwood Park improvements. Generally, the funding for that construction is still available, pending the final design of the park improvements, and all that allocated funding will be included for anything that is coming up through that park, and we look forward to do that. And lastly, is there a program, I think this is the perfect one to end on, to help our older adults make repairs to their homes? Yes, there is. We have multiple, but the number one is our Housing Upgrades to Benefit Seniors program. You can call 311 to get that if you have an older adult and ask to be transferred to the housing department, or you can provide that information for them by going to the city's housing department website, and we'll be at baltimorecity.gov, and that information is readily available for them there to make sure that our older adults who have worked so hard in the city of Baltimore are able to remain in their homes and pass that wealth on to other residents in their family. All right, I want to say thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to our fine budget leaders as we go through this process. I look forward to, if you guys send more of these things in, we look forward to having more discussion with you all, where we're looking forward to building a better Baltimore in partnership with everyone. This is just, again, the beginning of this, and thank you for your great questions and your in-depth comments here. I hope you found this session beneficial and that you understand a little bit more about how the budget is done and how it's different between capital and operating, and what the city is responsible for. And something I do think I want to mention, that because we know we get this a lot, right? And we mentioned highway user revenue earlier as we close, and I'm going to come to my guest too to talk about that. Folks talking about like roads and bridges and those things. If it's a neighborhood street, right, that is done local in-house by the Department of Transportation. The larger roads, your main roads, Reisterstown, Park Heights, etc., that's done through our federal program, and we also use highway user revenue funds for that. If you know, President Biden, we all champion this big infrastructure law that we have now. That is the biggest significant investment into that we've seen, because for many, many, many years, federal investment into that went down. which is why you saw local governments, not just here but across the country, have less ability to do that. In Maryland, the state highway user revenue also was dramatically cut during the Great Recession and wasn't put back until myself and every county executive in the state went to Annapolis last year. So now we'll be able to start to ramp that up as we pull down on infrastructure funding and HUR funds. But I did want to allow our guests to chime in on that, and then any closing remarks from you all.
For sure, yeah. So it's an exciting time for the city around highway user revenue. Fiscal 24 will be part of a ramp up where we will see a major increase in highway user revenue over a 5-year period that will really help to take the city's capital program as it comes to our roads to the next level. So in fiscal 24 in the capital budget, you see a lot of sort of efforts to kind of get as many projects as we can ready to go, so that when that the bigger increase comes in starting next year in fiscal 25, we're ready to go. And Kristen can say more about that.
Yes, it's really exciting. These additional HURs will allow us also to access more federal funding through competitive grants through that bipartisan infrastructure bill. And I know we've just had the announcement about winning that Reconnecting Communities grant, which is a huge investment into that part of Baltimore. So we're excited about the new projects we'll be able to do, and then the additional funding that we'll have for some of the more regular routine activities like street resurfacing.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this virtual budget town hall. Please stay safe, and we will see you on the streets of Baltimore. Peace.